A daring biker gang kidnaps a rancher's wife, unaware that she is a seasoned federal operative. The captive's secret identity is revealed, causing powerful criminal players to panic. Unexpected allies unite, risking everything to take on a dangerous syndicate. The rancher seeks help, realizing the enemy is far more formidable than mere outlaws. Former comrades and hidden contacts rally to dismantle the criminal network. The fate of the heroine and an entire region hangs by a thread, and the decisions to be made could change everything. Scores are settled in a final showdown, where the fate of the entire region hangs in the balance. Stay with us if you want to find out how this story ends, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because there are many more exciting plots ahead just for you. A thin layer of dust settled on the narrow state highway in southwestern Colorado, where the ridges stood in silent vigil under the afternoon sun. The land in that part of the state stretched wide, dotted with towering rock formations and sloping meadows that led toward the distant canyons. In the midst of this rugged expanse, the Avinger family ranch sprawled for miles, with weathered fences and cattle pens marking the outline of a place that had stood for generations. The ranch had always been considered a safe haven by its owners, who believed they had built an impenetrable fortress on those ancient soils. They had little reason to suspect that forces beyond their control were about to converge on them, drawn by hidden agendas and carefully laid plans. Helena Avinger was known to most people in the nearby towns as a quiet rancher's wife who preferred practical work attire and rarely bothered to mingle with the local social gatherings. Her hair, the color of autumn leaves, was usually tied back, while her boots displayed the kind of wear that came from tending animals and fixing fences every day. She had a way of reading the land that suggested a lifelong bond with its seasons and secrets. Neighbors remarked that she hardly ever raised her voice and seemed content to let her husband, Levi Avinger, handle all negotiations related to their cattle business. Helena moved carefully and deliberately, calculating every step, as though scanning her environment for hidden threats. Yet she concealed this watchfulness behind a calm exterior, giving no hint that she had once served as a federal tactical operative. Known in certain classified circles by a codename, the Raven, she had orchestrated covert raids on major crime syndicates across state lines. Very few of her new neighbors had ever heard that name or learned about that side of her life, and she intended to keep it that way. For the better part of a year, a group of bikers who called themselves the Blood Talons had been conducting strange activities around the region. They weren't the stereotypical weekend riders interested in heavy music and open roads, they belonged to a more dangerous breed. Whispers drifted from one county to the next about intimidation attempts aimed at property owners whose land bordered an old, disused railway. Some of those owners vanished under suspicious circumstances, leaving behind properties that were quickly sold off or signed away. Few law enforcement officials in the area were equipped or inclined to investigate, given the fragmentation between local sheriff's offices and the limited federal presence out in rural patches. Helena had begun to notice an increasing number of motorbikes rumbling across the unpaved roads that hemmed the ranch. She made a habit of waking before dawn, her eyes scanning the lines of the horizon, searching for headlights or any dust trails that might indicate prying eyes. Though she spoke little of her past life, she recognized certain patterns in these bikers' movements. They clocked the intervals during which ranch hands would leave for the far pasture. They monitored the times when shipments arrived for feed or supplies. They even measured how quickly a single phone call to the sheriff might bring help, not that any reliable backup would have arrived swiftly out there. Helena observed this pattern quietly, maintaining her role as an unassuming rancher's wife. Yet, inside, she was compiling evidence and laying out a mental map of every route, vantage point, and strategic weakness in the ranch's perimeter. Levi Avinger noticed subtle changes in his wife's behavior. He had always known there was more to her than the persona she presented to most people. He sensed her heightened vigilance, saw how she pretended not to hear a distant engine but in reality catalogued each mechanical sound with precision. Though Levi rarely pressed her to elaborate, he understood that she was preparing for something, and he knew to trust her instincts. Rumors that the Blood Talons had extended their operations to include black market runs for exotic arms circulated among some of the ranchers who liked to keep an ear to the ground. Nobody in the region felt entirely safe discussing it, so speculation remained whispered and incomplete. Far from the prying eyes of the local authorities, a man by the name of Miguel Salazar, thought to be the Blood Talons' de facto leader, set his sights on the Avinger ranch. He had grown frustrated by Helena's refusal to sign over certain parcels of land that abutted the old railway route, land rumored to contain valuable resources or at least a path conducive to smuggling. Salazar was one of those figures who used intimidation as a currency, but he preferred meticulous planning to blind aggression. He had men with specialized backgrounds, former mercenaries who understood advanced weaponry and surveillance tactics. It became clear that these associates had deeper motives than simply amassing territory for bike club activities. At sunrise one day, an unmarked van idled on a concealed dirt track behind the ranch's storage barn. A few ranch hands had already headed out, and Levi was occupied in the main pasture. Helena was inside the house, quietly standing by the kitchen window, scanning the tree line with the ease of someone who had done so countless times. She noted the break in the pattern of wind-blown branches and the faintest reflection off metal. There was no sign of local utility vehicles scheduled for that day, so she deduced an intruder might be setting up an observation post near the perimeter fence. Rather than sounding an alarm, Helena went on with her routine. She moved calmly through the house, as if searching for a misplaced ledger or deciding which chores needed priority. Her every muscle remained coiled, ready to act if necessary, but she had to give them the illusion that she was none the wiser. It took until late morning for the Blood Talons to make their move, using a combination of the unmarked van and several heavily customized bikes to pin down the entrance to the ranch. By then, Helena had carefully arranged for any loyal ranch workers to be far out on the range or running errands in town, which effectively cleared the building of potential collateral. Salazar approached the porch, flanked by men who carried themselves like professionals rather than mere street thugs. They forced their way inside, rummaging through the living area in search of documents or anything that might hold significance. Helena bided her time, outwardly displaying a semblance of shock while silently noting the radio frequencies the intruders were using to coordinate. She allowed them to bind her hands behind her back, making no move to resist. She offered no outward signs that she was anything but a frightened spouse who had no idea why these men would target a remote homestead. Before midday, she was taken from the ranch in one of their vehicles, leaving only scattered belongings and a faint sense of upheaval that would soon spread among the neighboring properties. This kidnapping did not spark the usual panic or immediate outcry that might be expected in more populated areas. The sheriff's office was notified by a passing field hand several hours later. That office had only a handful of deputies, and the nearest backup was miles away. While they began the process of investigating, they had too few resources to mount an immediate search. Levi, who returned in the early evening, discovered signs of the break-in and recognized that Helena would not have allowed herself to be taken unless she wanted the kidnappers to believe they had the upper hand. He stayed outwardly calm when questioned, explaining that he had no idea where his wife was, and that confusion was genuine enough for the local deputies. He chose not to mention her hidden background, suspecting she had a reason for vanishing as she did. Beneath the surface, Levi tried to piece together the puzzle, suspecting that Helena's disappearance tied directly to her old life creeping back to the surface. By nightfall, Helena had been transported to a disused warehouse near the edge of a small industrial district on the outskirts of a town known as Marlow Springs. The building stood a short distance from a narrow creek and was flanked by deserted lots overgrown with weeds. The Blood Talons considered this location secure, outfitted with portable generators and basic barricades. They believed they had captured nothing more than a stubborn landowner, fully expecting her husband to fold under the pressure of losing a loved one. Helena sat in a corner, her wrists restrained with plastic ties, watching men as they discussed logistical matters. She silently counted the boxes stacked against the walls, some containing firearms and some with unknown materials labeled in a code she recognized from black market shipments. She also observed the late-night arrival of two men dressed in expensive suits, individuals who seemed out of place in a grimy environment full of bike club muscle. This small detail confirmed her suspicion that there was a broader scheme in motion, something that reached beyond a local gang's usual intimidation tactics. Salazar entered the warehouse, walking with a deliberate stride. He greeted the suited figures with a respect seldom shown to ordinary associates, indicating that these visitors wielded considerable authority. Without acknowledging Helena, he conferred with them in low tones. Helena strained her hearing to catch half-spoken references to future expansions, carefully noting that the land near the railway corridor served not just as a route for contraband but possibly as a pipeline for something more significant, perhaps advanced technology or weapon components that required discrete transportation routes. She remained perfectly still, her gaze fixed on the floor, as if in despair. In reality, she was already planning her next steps to dismantle the entire operation. She knew that extraction teams from her old bureau might not be aware of her predicament because her retirement had been kept unofficial and off the books. She also knew she had certain resources and contacts who would respond if given the correct signal. Days wore on with Helena biding her time, permitting the blood talons to believe she had begun to yield to their demands. She occasionally feigned fear or exhaustion, giving them no cause to suspect her true capabilities. She observed their schedules, memorized their rotation patterns, and identified the individual who managed internal communications. This figure, a short, stocky man named Reuben, possessed an unfortunate tendency to leave electronics unguarded for brief moments. Helena saw him slip once, stepping away to use the restroom while leaving his phone on a makeshift desk. She inched closer, scanning the device's screen, confirming the coded references to shipments that were en route. The term Desert Hydra appeared multiple times. She took that name to mean a secondary organization or perhaps a higher-level sponsor funneling money into the blood talons. On the second night of her captivity, Helena noticed a new wave of tension rippling through the warehouse. Voices grew heated in the far corners. Some of the bikers began hurriedly moving crates labeled with shipping tags that included partial references to government contractors. The men in the suits made phone calls, their frustration evident in the clipped manner of their gestures and footsteps. Helena surmised that outside forces, possibly local authorities or rival syndicates, had placed pressure on the blood talons, forcing them to accelerate their plans. She recognized an opportunity in this sudden shift. If they were poised to move the contraband soon, they would either relocate her or leave her behind in the custody of a skeleton crew. Both scenarios worked in her favor, since she had already mentally marked each potential egress point in that old warehouse. Meanwhile, Levi made discreet attempts to track leads around town, talking with an old friend in the local trucking business to see if any unusual convoys were spotted. Word drifted back that unregistered shipments had been rolling through deserted highways late at night, guarded by men who displayed the blood talons insignia. Levi maintained a controlled demeanor, never revealing the deeper story, but he carefully stored every bit of intelligence, waiting for a moment when Helena might be found or might re-emerge on her own. The local deputies wanted to help, but they were out of their depth and had no standing to challenge an emerging paramilitary threat. Even the state troopers seemed reluctant to launch a full-scale operation without more concrete evidence. During her prolonged observation, Helena found a peculiar sense of detachment from her immediate danger. She recalled the missions she had led years ago when infiltration was the primary objective. This situation, though dire, felt strangely familiar. The smaller scale of this local network made it easier for her to map out the entire operation. But she also sensed that these local bikers were merely the tip of a far-reaching scheme. Each evening, she heard references to expansions in other states, to shipping routes beyond the southern desert, and to offshore connections that implied a global dimension. She allowed the tension to build, confident that at the right moment she could flip the entire scenario to her advantage. Eventually, Salazar realized that Levi had not made any public statements or attempts to negotiate. Word filtered back that the ranch continued its daily operations with minimal disruptions. This puzzled Salazar, who had expected immediate cooperation under the threat of losing a beloved spouse. Confusion spread among the gang members when no sign of desperation emerged from the Avinger ranch, and no pleas arrived from Levi to spare Helena. This confusion began to erode Salazar's confidence in their plan. He called for a meeting in a secluded corner of the warehouse, away from Helena's direct line of sight, but within range of her keen hearing. There, he discussed the possibility that Helena might be more than a simple rancher's wife. The men in suits, particularly one with a heavy accent that hinted at overseas ties, expressed the importance of resolving the land acquisition swiftly. They worried that too much attention would jeopardize other shipments moving through the corridor. As tensions mounted, Helena detected a growing fracture within the ranks of the Blood Talons. The bikers were local enforcers, used to intimidation but uncomfortable with the suggestion that they might be dealing with a trained operative. The men in suits grew restless, pressing for immediate results and chiding Salazar for not breaking Helena's will. Salazar, caught between wanting to maintain control of his men and appease these external backers, became increasingly volatile. He doubled the guards posted around Helena, insisted on round-the-clock surveillance, and restricted the movements of all personnel. He intended to prove he was still in charge of the situation, never realizing that each move he made helped Helena gather intelligence about the entire chain of command. The small ecosystem inside that warehouse reached a boiling point when Salazar ordered a test shipment to pass through the region without finalizing ownership of the land around the old railway. This defied the men in suits, who argued it was too soon to make a move without securing local territory. Helena, now fully aware of their internal discord, recognized the perfect moment to sow a little more chaos. She carefully manipulated the narrative, pretending to overhear conversation about potential infiltration by state police and subtly mentioning it aloud in a tone of disbelief when she was within earshot of the rank-and-file bikers. Her measured words implied a threat larger than any local department, planting seeds of doubt in the minds of those who were already questioning their chain of command. Though Helena used no direct speech, her carefully chosen remarks, spoken in a subdued manner, created a ripple effect. Uncertainty spread through the group like a virus, prompting hurried phone calls and further arguments among the leadership. All the while, Helena maintained the facade of captivity, letting them keep her tied to a metal chair in a remote corner of the facility. She knew that staying restrained gave her the advantage of being underestimated. Occasionally, Salazar would pace near her, shooting furious glances in her direction, as if blaming her existence for every complication. The tension in the air thickened each time an argument broke out among the bikers or when one of the suits received a cryptic message on his phone. In a matter of days, the Blood Talons had shifted from a poised, methodical outfit to a paranoid cluster of individuals scrambling to hold on to an operation that threatened to slip from their fingers. As late-night strategy sessions continued, Helena pieced together that the Blood Talons were part of a larger organization tentatively called the Iron Depth Network, which specialized in smuggling high-tech weapon parts. The suits were merely front men for hidden investors, and their infiltration into southwestern Colorado was part of a strategic plan to establish a discrete supply line. This plan relied on controlling pockets of land near outdated infrastructure, such as old rail lines or abandoned airstrips, to quietly move contraband. The Avinger Ranch sat on a particularly valuable stretch, forming a gateway between remote desert towns and highways that connected to major shipping routes. None of this would have been possible to confirm had Helena not allowed herself to be taken inside the operation. On the sixth night since her kidnapping, the stress among the bikers intensified. Helena remained in place, motionless except for her unblinking eyes that scanned every corner. The portable generators hummed, casting flickering shadows across the warehouse walls. Stacks of crates lay half-packed, signaling that the group was prepared to clear out at a moment's notice. She could almost taste the adrenaline in the air, an aroma she had known many times before in her previous career. She was aware that a final catalyst would soon ignite the situation, leading to a confrontation that might topple the entire network or cause them to scatter. Somewhere not too far away, Levi weighed his own options. He had discreetly contacted a retired federal marshal named Oswald Lane, an acquaintance who possessed enough remaining influence to initiate an off-the-record inquiry. Lane had heard rumors through old channels about an infiltration scheme in southwestern Colorado, matching the pattern of the Blood Talons. Though he lacked the official capacity to engage in a full-scale rescue, Lane suspected that Helena's disappearance was tied to a carefully orchestrated plan. He scoured any available data, quietly gleaning fragments of information from contacts in different agencies, searching for the slightest trace that might confirm Helena's location. He also knew Helena could handle herself under extreme conditions. The more time passed, the more certain he became that she was gathering intelligence from within, setting the stage for her own brand of justice. Helena was, indeed, positioning herself for a decisive strike. She bided her time, confident that the disarray among the blood talons would offer a window. She replayed tactical maneuvers in her mind, recalling how to subdue opponents swiftly and how to exploit the environment. The old warehouse had narrow corridors, catwalks above the main floor, and adjacent storerooms where heavy machinery had once been stored. She envisioned the layout, planning routes to slip out if needed or to neutralize her captors in a more direct manner. Each day spent in captivity yielded more data about who these men reported to and what they planned to do if the old railway corridor remained inaccessible. As tension rose to a near breaking point, the men in suits brought grim news. External buyers had begun questioning the reliability of the southwestern route. They demanded proof of compliance from the blood talons, effectively pressuring Salazar to deliver or lose crucial financial backing. Salazar, fueled by pride and desperation, decided that an immediate demonstration of control would be the only way to salvage his reputation. He declared that Helena was the key to forcing Levi's compliance, as well as the compliance of any property owners who might still be on the fence. At that moment, Helena felt the final piece of the puzzle fall into place. She had spent enough time studying her captors, memorized their patterns, identified the friction lines between them, and knew that she was about to be used as a bargaining chip. But in her mind, the advantage belonged to her. Helena sensed that events were about to spin toward a decisive confrontation. Tensions among the blood talons had reached a point where one small spark could ignite a chain reaction of violence and betrayal. She remained tied to the metal chair in the corner of the warehouse, her body stiff but her mind active. The men in dark suits kept hovering near Salazar, urging him to accelerate every plan they had in motion. Their words, delivered in low, tense voices, implied that powerful figures expected results soon. Helena observed them finalize instructions to load certain crates into vehicles long before the scheduled time of departure. She recognized that they feared their window of safe passage was closing. The bikes were parked in neat rows outside under the flickering glow of high-mounted lamps. Groups of anxious enforcers paced in front of the shuttered main door, each of them waiting for orders that never seemed to come. In the half-lit gloom, the disused factory equipment cast hulking silhouettes that lent the entire warehouse an atmosphere of barely contained chaos. The bikers kept glancing at Helena, some with pity, some with contempt, and some with outright fear. She had noticed that word of her possibly dangerous background had spread among them, although most tried to dismiss it as paranoid rumor. Deep into that evening, Salazar summoned a handful of his most trusted men to a makeshift command area hidden behind a tarp. Helena could see the shifting beams of flashlights as they pored over a series of printed maps. She deduced that these diagrams showed the layout of the region around the old railway, as well as connecting roads and back routes. Men occasionally emerged from behind the tarp carrying manila folders and electronic tablets. Each time someone left, Helena caught glimpses of tension etched across their faces, revealing that the meeting was not going smoothly. The men in suits began pacing back and forth, stepping outside to make frantic phone calls, returning only to convey more pressure. They reminded Salazar of upcoming deadlines set by individuals whose reach extended far beyond Colorado's borders. Meanwhile, Levi Avinger maintained an outward front of simple concern, politely answering questions from neighbors who wondered about Helena's absence. He made sure the livestock were cared for, continuing the day-to-day work so that nothing appeared unusual. In quieter moments, he conferred with Oswald Lane, the retired marshal who was tapping into old networks with limited success. Both men acknowledged that Helena's hidden expertise meant she might already have a plan to undermine her captors from within. Their main fear was that the organization holding her might be more extensive than any local operation. Lane hinted that a deeper infiltration plot was unfolding, one that might take state or federal authorities months to fully investigate. At the warehouse, Helena began testing the physical restraints that bound her wrists. She detected a slight weakness in one of the plastic ties, probably caused by a sloppy application under stress. Though she could easily break free if she applied sudden force at the right angle, she held off, preferring to choose a precise moment to act. She continued to observe every argument, every shift in the power structure among the blood talons. Occasional outbursts from Salazar suggested that the men in suits were growing more impatient, going so far as to threaten withdrawing their support if the ranch was not surrendered soon. Helena reasoned that she could exploit that rift. However, she also knew she needed to wait until the tension escalated enough for the gang members themselves to become distracted and more prone to mistakes. On the following afternoon, Helena noticed the arrival of two vehicles that bore no motorcycle club insignia. Armed guards emerged, each wearing earpieces and moving with polished, military-like efficiency. Their presence caused unease among the bikers, who gave these new arrivals a wide berth. Helena understood that these fresh arrivals were not standard enforcers. Their posture and discipline indicated specialized training, perhaps from private security firms or paramilitary backgrounds. They swiftly took control of the perimeter, installing portable cameras in corners Helena had not seen monitored before. They set up jamming devices to block outside communications, though Helena recognized that at least one of the suits wanted a secure line open to contact higher-ups. One of these newcomers, a tall figure with steel-gray hair and an air of cold authority, immediately demanded private access to the portion of the warehouse where Helena sat bound. He studied her from a distance, likely probing for weaknesses or signs of deception. Although no words passed between them, the new arrival radiated suspicion and confidence. Soon afterward, he instructed two subordinates to stand guard near Helena, freeing up the bikers to handle other tasks. Helena realized that the blood talons were no longer fully in charge of the operation. These external specialists had effectively commandeered it. She also suspected that they had enough knowledge or training to identify her as a potential threat. While this shift occurred inside the building, Salazar and his original lieutenants found themselves locked in a clash of priorities with the men in suits, who insisted that the intimidation tactic needed to be escalated immediately. The suits brought new intelligence that suggested law enforcement had begun discreet inquiries. Although official raids were not yet underway, time was no longer on their side. Salazar called for a forced negotiation with Levi, intending to release staged photos or information that might coerce him into signing over the necessary tracts of land. Helena, listening from her corner, understood that any forced negotiation would provide an opening for outside involvement. She also guessed that Salazar planned to keep her alive just long enough to ensure cooperation. At dusk, the specialized guards busied themselves with reconfiguring the vehicles parked outside for swift departure. Helena noted that the largest truck among them had reinforced panels, hinting at the transport of something extremely valuable or sensitive. She surmised that the cargo might contain high-end contraband or cutting-edge components intended for clandestine research labs. Several heavy crates remained stacked near a loading dock at the rear of the warehouse, each labeled with cryptic markings that pointed to a direct link with advanced weapons manufacturing. She could hear the faint hum of battery-operated devices within some of the boxes, suggesting that the cargo needed careful handling. This was no ordinary arms trade, it involved technology that required precise climate control or containment. Through the tension and secretive maneuvers, Helena maintained a calm that stemmed from past experiences. She had navigated operations far more complex than this, though never entirely on her own. She recalled the quiet efficiency of her former team members, the synchronized way they would breach a compound with minimal casualties. Here, she had to rely solely on herself, meaning her timing needed to be impeccable to avoid being caught in the crossfire. She decided to begin undermining the newly arrived specialists. When one of them left to coordinate an external checkpoint, the other remained behind, occasionally stepping into a narrower side corridor for privacy. Helena subtly tested her restraints, building tension in the brittle plastic. With every passing hour, she felt the cracks expanding, but she still withheld the final snap. Late in the evening, she caught wind of the plan to relocate her to another facility. The suits wanted to secure a more tightly controlled environment, fearful that the crumbling authority of the blood talons might lead to an unexpected confrontation they could not contain. If Helena were moved to a second location, likely an undisclosed stronghold, it would be much harder for her to access the data she needed to bring the entire network down. She had gained remarkable insight into their operations during her time in the warehouse, and she feared losing that advantage if they transported her elsewhere. She needed to act soon. In the early hours before dawn, the industrial lamps flickered, indicating a possible fault with the portable generators. The momentary darkness caused a surge of concern among the guards, who rushed to secure the perimeter. Salazar barked instructions that filtered across the open space, telling men to stay vigilant for any intrusion. The suits grew increasingly agitated, pointing out that such an electrical glitch was an opening for rival factions or law enforcement. Helena saw the flicker of lights as a perfect chance to sow discord. She shifted her weight to place stress on the plastic ties, weakening them further, then stilled when she heard footsteps approach. One of the paramilitary guards stood just a few feet away from her. He took out a handheld scanner to check for concealed transmitters, waving it across her body without making direct eye contact. Helena feigned fatigue, letting her head slump as though the extended captivity had drained her willpower. The guard seemed convinced that she posed no immediate danger. He turned away, returning his attention to the device's screen. In that brief instant, she noted a small keycard clipped to his belt. The card might offer access to restricted areas, possibly even the crates with the advanced technology. If she could acquire it, she might find a way to sabotage the cargo or collect incriminating evidence. Throughout the night, the power fluctuated multiple times, each occurrence triggering a round of hurried checks. The specialists complained that the portable generators were subpar, but they had no alternative on such short notice. Helena used each instance of semi-darkness to shift her posture or slide the plastic ties fractionally further apart. She watched the men from the suits converse in hushed tones about something called the Silver Crescent, which they described as a joint operation that extended beyond state lines and involved multiple front companies. The mention of the Silver Crescent clarified for Helena that the Iron Depth Network had a sophisticated structure, encompassing global trade routes and a labyrinth of shell entities. The Southwestern Corridor was but one piece of a larger puzzle. By the time the weak dawn light filtered through the high windows, the men in suits had decided that Helena would be moved at nightfall. They issued orders to relocate certain high-value crates first, presumably to ensure that if law enforcement arrived, only minor contraband would be discovered. Salazar seemed resigned to the fact that his group was losing authority. He barked at his men to comply, grudgingly accepting that external forces were now in control. Helena inferred that the bikers might eventually turn on Salazar if they felt betrayed or if they suspected him of being manipulated. She also knew that if she failed to exploit these divisions now, she might never get another chance. During the mid-morning lull, as some of the guards dozed off or wandered away for a quick meal, Helena enacted the next phase of her plan. She pressed downward on her restraints, snapping the weakened plastic tie. The crack was faint, nearly drowned out by the incessant hum of generators and the soft chatter of men near the entrance. With her hands free, she maintained the facade of being bound, keeping her wrists positioned as though still restrained. She then waited for a moment and the paramilitary guard with the keycard strolled into her vicinity. The guard appeared, scanning the space for any anomalies. Helena glanced at him fleetingly. He turned away for a split second to check something on a small console. In that blink of an eye, Helena launched from the chair, locked one arm around his neck, and used her free hand to snatch the keycard. She applied just enough pressure to render him unconscious without causing permanent harm, then eased him to the floor. She moved swiftly, dragging him behind a row of stacked crates. Once hidden, she manipulated his radio to broadcast static at the designated check-in times, hoping to delay the moment his absence would be noticed. Her next step was to secure a better hiding spot and gather intelligence from any accessible electronics. She used the keycard to open a metallic locker in a side corridor, discovering a trove of surveillance equipment, along with stored laptops and a small server unit. She recognized that the suits had been intercepting local cell signals and scanning for signs of infiltration. A quick scan revealed that the system contained partial shipping manifests and references to the Silver Crescent. She read through them quickly, memorizing details. Then she spotted an encrypted file labeled with a series of letters and numbers that she suspected might be a blueprint for the smuggling route. She set the server to copy that file onto an external drive she found attached to a USB cable. The transfer process took painfully long minutes. She could feel her pulse in her ears, worried someone might walk in at any moment. While the data copied, she heard movement in the adjacent room. Several men were discussing how best to load the next batch of crates without tipping off local authorities. One of them, a higher-ranking associate of Salazar, proposed driving the trucks south, then transferring them to smaller vans in a remote canyon. Another insisted that any detour would risk more suspicion from border patrols. Helena recognized from their arguments that neither of them possessed a full grasp of the bigger picture. They were local operators, trying to navigate a complex enterprise that extended well beyond their territory. At last, the file transfer finished. Helena secured the external drive under her shirt, then took a breath to steady herself. She heard approaching footsteps, so she quickly slipped out of the side corridor and hid behind a row of shelves. The newcomer, a man wearing the same paramilitary attire, strode in to check the locker. He discovered the unconscious guard slumped behind the crates and sounded an alarm. Within seconds, the warehouse erupted into chaos. Alarms and shouted orders echoed from one end to the other as men fanned out, weapons drawn, searching for Helena. The suits tried to coordinate a lockdown, instructing the paramilitary personnel to protect the cargo at all costs. Helena moved deftly between the tall stacks of crates, her years of field training guiding her steps. She avoided open areas, using the shadows to mask her presence. She heard bursts of radio chatter indicating that some men believed she had fled the warehouse. Others suspected she might still be hiding inside. She could also discern that the plan to relocate her had just accelerated. They wanted her found or eliminated before nightfall. She recognized that the external keycard might not open all the restricted compartments in the building, but it was a good start. Gunfire erupted near the loading dock. Helena deduced that one of the bikers, unsure who was moving in the darkness, had panicked and fired a shot. This triggered more confusion, with paramilitary guards shouting commands to hold fire. Helena capitalized on that confusion, slipping deeper into the facility. She stopped to check a rusted side door she had noticed earlier. It was chained from the outside, likely an old security measure from the building's former life. She stepped back into the corridor, scanning for an alternative path. In an adjacent storeroom, she found a narrow flight of stairs leading to the catwalks above the main floor. She climbed quickly, keeping her steps light. From that elevated vantage, she could see the entire warehouse floor, the chaotic search parties, the suits frantically checking crates and laptops, Salazar standing in the middle, barking orders at men who no longer seemed certain whom to trust. The paramilitary guards moved with a rigid discipline that contrasted sharply with the bikers' scattered approach. Helena recognized that this mismatch in tactics would inevitably lead to more mistakes. She took a moment to weigh her options. She could slip outside and vanish into the rugged countryside, returning with reinforcements. But that would mean losing the advantage of immediate access to the contraband. Alternatively, she could sabotage key parts of their operation right then and there. She recalled the special crates containing equipment that needed climate controls, deducing that disabling those controls might ruin the cargo or at least force them to abort their transport. She quietly made her way across the catwalk, stepping around rusted beams and old machinery. When she reached a vantage point above the specialized crates, she waited for the patrolling guards to move toward another section of the warehouse. Then, using a length of cord she found coiled near some old winches, she lowered herself onto a stack of pallets. Landing without a sound, she crouched beside the nearest crate. She used the stolen keycard to access the digital lock, feeling her heart pound as the lock clicked open. Inside, she found a complex piece of equipment that seemed to be some form of miniature reactor or advanced power core, encased in what looked like protective plating. She fiddled with the device's control panel, looking for a way to disrupt its calibration. Without fully understanding its inner workings, she could at least disable the cooling fans or cut wires that appeared integral. She worked methodically, recalling her experiences dismantling similar contraband in earlier covert assignments. The device emitted a flicker of warning lights, then powered down. She quickly shut the crate and locked it, hoping that any outward signs of tampering would remain minimal until it was too late for them to correct. In the distance, Salazar's voice rose above the din. He was threatening to tear the warehouse apart piece by piece if his men did not find Helena soon. The suits seemed more concerned with safeguarding the shipments. One of them gestured fiercely at a half-loaded truck, urging the drivers to depart immediately. The paramilitary guards tried to coordinate a perimeter sweep, but the bikers, believing themselves betrayed, resisted the notion that an outsider could simply take over their territory. Confrontations flared up in random corners, and the entire place felt like a powder keg on the verge of exploding. Helena recognized that she needed a final piece of evidence to connect this local operation to higher-level conspirators. She had some data on the external drive, but the partial manifests she copied might not be sufficient to dismantle the Silver Crescent or the Iron Depth network. She scanned the open floor for the suit's electronic devices. She spotted one individual, the tall figure with steel-gray hair, carrying a briefcase that emitted a faint blinking light from an embedded sensor. She decided that retrieving or accessing that briefcase might yield more complete intelligence. She crept through the shadows, waiting for a lull in the guard's movements. The steel-haired figure took position by the loading dock, barking into his headset that the trucks had to leave at once. He appeared to be keying in a command on some sort of digital pad attached to the case. Helena slipped closer, using the lines of stacked crates as cover. A single guard stood nearby, scanning the area, but the flickering overhead lights and intermittent generator issues provided enough pockets of darkness for her to inch forward undetected. She inched behind a tall wooden crate stamped with partially recognizable military markings. The moment the steel-haired figure turned his back, she made her move. She sprang forward, knocking the guard off balance. Before he could regain his footing, she twisted the rifle strap from his shoulder, using it to force him to the ground. She snatched the briefcase from the startled steel-haired figure's grasp. He managed to draw a sidearm, but Helena ducked behind a piece of machinery, using the heavy steel plating as cover from his line of fire. Bullets clanged against the metal, ringing out across the enclosed space. Several bikers, alarmed by the gunfire, rushed over, uncertain of who was attacking whom. That confusion granted Helena precious seconds. She clutched the briefcase to her chest and retreated toward a dimly lit service corridor that led to the rear of the building. An alarm blared again, and lights flashed in warning mode. Helena pressed on, adrenaline fueling her as she considered an exit route. The corridor she entered ended in a padlocked door. She used the guard's keycard, but it had no effect on the standard padlock. She dug through her pockets for anything that might help, cursing silently that she had no specialized tools with her. Then she heard footsteps pounding behind her, echoing off the concrete walls. She took 2 steps back, braced herself, and delivered a forceful kick to the hinge side of the door. The weakened metal frame bent, allowing enough give for her to squeeze through. She slipped outside, the stinging cold air of early morning hitting her face. Outside the rear of the warehouse lay a weed-choked lot bordered by a chain-link fence. Beyond the fence, the road ran parallel to a dried creek bed, forming a narrow passage that offered minimal cover. She glanced around, searching for a vehicle or a place to hide. A single pickup truck was parked near the fence, likely used by one of the bikers assigned to perimeter duty. The driver was nowhere to be seen, probably inside dealing with the turmoil. Helena bolted for the vehicle. She tested the door handle and found it unlocked. She slid into the driver's seat, dumping the briefcase onto the passenger side. With frantic speed, she located the keys under the visor, a common oversight among those who felt secure in their territory. Engine roaring to life, she slammed her foot on the accelerator, steering the pickup toward the fence. She braced for impact as the truck plowed through the sagging chain-link barrier. Metal screeched and tore, but the momentum carried her through to the road beyond. In the rearview mirror, she saw the silhouettes of bikers emerging from the warehouse, pointing guns in her direction. She zigzagged to make herself a harder target, hearing bullets whiz by or ricochet off the truck's metal frame. The rugged terrain jolted the suspension, but she managed to keep control, speeding away from the warehouse until it receded into the distance. Only after putting considerable distance between herself and the complex did Helena allow herself to exhale. She knew the pursuit would not end, but she had gained a critical advantage. In her possession was the external drive containing partial manifests and the steel-haired figure's briefcase, which likely held the more comprehensive records she needed. She found a narrow dirt path concealed by thick brush and steered the pickup deep into the scrubland until the warehouse was entirely out of sight. With shaky hands, she turned off the engine and took a moment to calm her breathing. The stolen briefcase felt heavy with potential secrets. She flicked open the latch and peered inside. Rows of neatly stacked documents and a secure digital tablet greeted her. She recognized encryption modules attached to the tablet, indicating that the data was highly sensitive. She also noticed a small notebook with what seemed to be a catalog of coded references. The name Silver Crescent appeared multiple times, alongside line items that spelled out quantities, dates, and abbreviations. Each row suggested a complicated series of shipments routed through various states and possibly beyond. Her pulse quickened. The evidence here was enough to trigger a multi-agency investigation if placed in the right hands. But she also noted, with grim realization, that the notebook mentioned contacts in both the public and private sectors, meaning the conspiracy stretched into places she might never have expected. She leaned back against the seat, considering her next move. Contacting local law enforcement was futile, given the scope and infiltration she had uncovered. She thought of Oswald Lane, recalling how he had mentioned colleagues who still trusted him in certain branches of federal service. Yet, she had to confirm a secure method to deliver the evidence. The paramilitary group likely had advanced surveillance capabilities and might be tracking phone signals or monitoring official communication channels. She knew she had to proceed carefully, ideally using a prearranged set of codes or a clandestine relay point. She turned the ignition key again, mindful that the battered fence and bullet holes in the truck might draw attention once she got closer to any populated area. She navigated through overgrown back roads, searching for a remote location where she could stash the truck and travel on foot. Time was of the essence. The men in suits would not stop hunting her, and Salazar, humiliated by her escape, would be all the more determined to recapture her and salvage his standing. She recalled an old ghost town on the far edge of the desert foothills, a place called Barrow Creek. It had once been a mining settlement, abandoned for decades, but it provided a scattering of buildings that might offer temporary concealment. If she could make it there, she could reassess her options without immediate pursuit. The dirt roads were treacherous. Loose gravel and deep ruts made for an unstable ride. Each jolt threatened to throw her off the path, but she guided the truck carefully, keeping it at a moderate speed. She passed a few dusty signposts that had not been maintained for years, verifying that she was going in the right direction. The morning sky was growing steadily brighter, painting the horizon in pale orange tones. She felt a pang of exhaustion, having run mostly on adrenaline for days, but she forced herself to remain alert. Reaching the outskirts of Barrow Creek, she slowed the truck, scanning for any signs of life. Broken-down houses with caved-in roofs and boarded windows lined a single main street, flanked by a collapsed wooden walkway. She inched the truck behind a large shed that had partially survived the ravages of time and weather. The walls were pocked with bullet holes from an era when local gangs had used the ghost town as a hideout. She switched off the engine, quickly gathered her belongings, and took one last look at the stolen vehicle. It was riddled with damage, including a shattered side window, so any observer would know it had been in a confrontation. She slipped out of the cab, careful to leave no identifying traces, then carried the briefcase and external drive deeper into the ghost town's alleyways. Amid the wreckage of the old settlement, she found a dilapidated house that still had an intact cellar hatch. She pried it open, disturbing a nest of small desert creatures, which scattered at her intrusion. Inside the cellar, she found a dry corner shielded from direct sunlight. She removed a small flashlight from a shelf, left there by unknown visitors long ago. Though its batteries were nearly dead, it produced enough of a glow to let her examine the digital tablet in the briefcase. She discovered that it required a biometric scan to unlock. She had no way to replicate the steel-haired figure's fingerprint or retinal pattern, meaning she would have to rely on the possibility of gleaning partial data from the memory if she could bypass the device's initial security layers. She recognized it would be a risky undertaking, likely requiring specialized hardware or external software that she did not currently possess. She turned her attention to the physical documents. Some were passports under false names, each tied to an alias that suggested a wide network of agents working for the Iron Depth Network or the Silver Crescent. She also found shipping manifests that corroborated what she had already seen. In the margins were notes referencing the Southwestern Corridor, the old railway line, and the strategic importance of controlling certain ranches. They specifically named the Avinger Ranch as a keystone property. She realized that her home stood in the epicenter of a complex scheme designed to move illicit technology through remote areas. This was more than a local gang trying to seize land. It was the orchestrated infiltration of a region by a vast web of collaborators. Hours passed as she meticulously documented each relevant detail in her mind. Determined that even if these items were lost, she would remember enough to expose the syndicate. Now her main challenge was coordinating a safe extraction. She wondered if Levi had taken steps to protect himself, fearing that the Blood Talons might lash out in desperation. She also wondered what Oswald Lane might have discovered in her absence. With no direct line of contact, she considered her next steps carefully, recalling an abandoned radio tower half a mile beyond the edge of Barrow Creek. The tower might provide a vantage point to scan for approaching vehicles and possibly even patch into an older frequency range if the tower's equipment was salvageable. That would at least allow her to send a coded broadcast or intercept signals from any pursuit team. Night descended on the ghost town, bringing with it a biting chill that crept through the gaps in the cellar walls. Helena huddled against a corner, going over the plan in her mind. She would wait until just before dawn, then make her way to the tower under the cloak of darkness. If the tower offered a workable communications array, she would attempt to contact Oswald Lane through an indirect method, employing coded references from her prior missions. If the tower proved useless, she would continue on foot, relying on the truck only as a last resort, aware that it might have a tracking device she had not detected. In the meantime, she wrestled with the burden of her stolen evidence. She recognized that many figures in the Silver Crescent and the Iron Depth Network would be willing to resort to extreme measures to retrieve or destroy the contents of the briefcase. She also believed that the paramilitary guards and the suits would scour every possible route through the region, setting up roadblocks or scanning for any digital footprint she might leave behind. She was essentially on her own, an ex-operative against a vast conspiracy with global reach. Yet she felt no despair, only a calm resolve that came from knowing she had uncovered the truth about their operation, and that her next move could make the difference between their plan succeeding or collapsing. She dozed in short intervals through the cold night, never fully relaxing. Every sound outside made her tense, expecting at any moment that a search party might descend on Barrow Creek. A few times, she heard what sounded like distant engines, but they did not grow louder. She took it as a sign that the Blood Talons or their paramilitary allies were focusing elsewhere, possibly combing the highways or other known safe houses. By the time the moon crossed its zenith, the ghost town was silent again. Helena forced herself to remain still, wanting to leave only in the final hours before dawn, when fatigue would weigh heaviest on any would-be trackers. The moment arrived just before first light. She emerged from the cellar, the stolen briefcase in one hand and a makeshift pack carrying the external drive and some of the vital documents. She picked her way through the rubble of the abandoned house, stepping over fallen beams. The wind had died down, leaving an eerie quiet that magnified each crunch of gravel beneath her boots. She crept through the alleyway, heading east toward the silhouette of the old radio tower that loomed over a ridge. The structure stood on slightly higher ground, a crooked outline against the faint glow of impending sunrise. Reaching the base of the tower, she discovered a chain-link fence topped with rusted barbed wire. Most of it had collapsed over time, so she slipped through a gap. A small equipment shed stood next to the tower, its door partially ajar. Inside, she found a defunct control panel, a tangle of cables, and a cracked desk that might have once supported broadcasting instruments. She ran her hands across the dusty surfaces, looking for anything that might still be functional. The power to the tower had obviously been shut off years ago, and any backup batteries or generators had long since deteriorated. Nonetheless, she examined the tower's main support struts, locating an access ladder that climbed to a small platform nearly 30 feet above the ground. She decided to scale it carefully, stowing the briefcase and her pack behind the desk so she could climb unencumbered. The ladder creaked under her weight, and she paused often, scanning the horizon for any sign of movement. From the top platform, she had a panoramic view of the ghost town and the surrounding desert. The horizon was turning a pale shade of violet as dawn approached. She squinted, surveying the roads in every direction, searching for headlight beams or dust trails. She saw none. Below, the battered shells of Barrow Creek lay silent, a testament to the passage of time and shifting fortunes. The quiet felt oppressive, as though the entire landscape held its breath, waiting for the next wave of turmoil. She lingered there, watching for what felt like an eternity, ready to descend at the slightest movement. Her thoughts drifted to the data she carried, the partial shipping manifests, the references to the southwestern corridor, and the carefully kept list of names. She knew that if she could get these materials into the hands of an uncorrupted agency, the entire chain of events leading to Colorado's infiltration might be exposed. But she had no illusions about the dangers she would face. The Blood Talons alone posed a formidable threat, and the paramilitary specialists answered to even more dangerous entities. Eventually, she climbed down, convinced that there were no immediate pursuers. She returned to the small equipment shed, locked its door from the inside with a length of wire, then switched on the flashlight. She set the briefcase and her pack on the desk, preparing to examine the contents in more detail. She wanted to see if any internal component of the digital tablet might be removable or if the encryption had a known vulnerability she could exploit. She also thought she might find a shortwave radio that, by some miracle, still worked, but her search yielded nothing more than twisted scraps of metal and ancient circuit boards. Still, she persisted, prying open the briefcase's hidden compartments. One slot yielded a cluster of microSD cards, each labeled with a sequence of alphanumeric characters. She held them up to the faltering beam of her flashlight, reading the notations. They appeared to be partial backups of key data, perhaps an off-site record of shipments or financial transactions. If the paramilitary group's mission was to protect these records, the suit with steel-gray hair had likely been given explicit orders to keep them secure. Her possession of them meant that a vital piece of the conspiracy's infrastructure was under threat. A new wave of weariness swept over her, but she steadied herself. She had reached a temporary refuge, but she knew it was only a matter of time before the desert sun rose high and the risk of detection increased. She considered whether to attempt a daytime rest and move at night. However, staying put too long might make it easier for the enemy to locate her, especially if they had aerial support or drones. Ultimately, she decided that her best course of action was to continue onward after a brief pause, aiming to reach more populated areas under the cover of darkness. From there, she could try to contact Oswald Lane or locate a secure drop point where she could hand off the evidence. Far in the distance, as the sun's first rays crept over the hills, Helena thought she saw faint plumes of dust. They could be from ranch vehicles or from search parties looking for her. She could not be certain at that range, but it heightened her sense of urgency. The illusions of calm that Barrow Creek offered might vanish quickly if the Blood Talons or their paramilitary allies were near. She packed the microSD cards, the external drive, and the physical documents carefully. She also splashed some water from a half-rusted container onto her face, hoping to stay alert in the rising heat. Stepping out of the shed, she felt the day's warmth already intensifying. The ghost town remained silent, with no wind to stir the broken window shutters or the dried weeds poking through cracks in the pavement. Everything around her lay in a kind of suspended animation. She followed the path of an old dirt lane on foot, moving as quietly as possible, leaving behind the stolen pickup to avoid detection. Her only companions were the crows perched on the ruins, watching her progress with curious black eyes. Each step carried her farther from one danger and potentially closer to another, but she pressed on, fueled by the knowledge that the evidence in her possession could topple an entire criminal enterprise. Far behind her, In the battered warehouse near Marlow Springs, Salazar and the paramilitary team reeled from the shock of Helena's escape. They took swift, brutal measures to reassert control, detaining any biker who showed signs of questioning Salazar's authority. The men in suits demanded an immediate search of every nearby town, ranch, and remote settlement. They scoured the highways, setting up unmarked checkpoints under the pretense of road maintenance. Their frustration boiled over as they realized the scale of the intelligence breach. Salazar's voice carried through the building as he threatened dire consequences if Helena was not found. The steel-haired figure, nursing a bruise from her earlier assault, barked commands over a scrambled frequency, ordering the mobilization of more specialized units. Even the trucks loaded with advanced contraband paused their journeys, forced to reroute until it could be confirmed that Helena was truly gone. The men in suits feared that local law enforcement might have been tipped off, so they directed the convoy to a secondary hideout miles away, deep in the desert, where an abandoned missile silo had been converted into a clandestine storage site. There, they hoped to regroup, re-establish communications with their superiors, and plan a more systematic manhunt. Yet, the more they tightened their grip, the more fractious their relationships became, with each faction blaming the others for the debacle. The bikers accused the paramilitary team of arrogance, the paramilitary specialists considered the bikers undisciplined, and the suits walked a fine line trying to appease everyone while reporting the failure up the chain of command. Unbeknownst to them, Helena was already miles away, weaving a path through the desert's hidden trails, taking advantage of every hollowed-out ravine and patch of scraggly brush for cover. She was used to running missions under the hottest sun and the darkest nights, and she knew how to blend her footsteps into the land's contours. Her plan was not merely to survive or to evade capture, it was to bring the entire operation crashing down. She pressed forward as the sun rose higher, ignoring the fatigue in her muscles, the dryness in her throat, and the relentless glare. She was confident that, for now, the desert and its vast emptiness shielded her from immediate pursuit. She felt no triumph in outsmarting her captors, only a focused resolve. For every mile she put behind her, she came a step closer to unraveling the Silver Crescent, the Iron Depth Network, and all the corrupt alliances that had set these events into motion. Her only regret was leaving Levi in the dark, but she consoled herself with the knowledge that he would find ways to protect the ranch and that she would eventually return to set things right. As she disappeared into the shimmering horizon, her thoughts turned to the next phase of her mission. She carried within her a trove of secrets that could either be her greatest weapon or her undoing. She also knew that powerful adversaries would stop at nothing to silence her. But she had come too far, witnessed too much, to allow fear to overtake her. She moved with purpose, each footstep drawing her closer to a final reckoning with those who believed they could hide in the shadows forever. Helena walked for hours beneath a sky of unrelenting heat, each step guided by her own calculations of time, distance, and concealment. She traversed narrow gullies and low ridges, pausing every so often to scan the horizon. Dust and sweat clung to her skin, and a persistent thirst gnawed at her focus. Yet she pressed on, mindful that any miscalculation could bring pursuers down upon her. The stolen evidence weighed heavily in her makeshift pack, a tangible reminder of the conspiracy she intended to expose. She spotted occasional tire tracks scarring the desert floor, proof that the region was not so remote as it appeared. Some belonged to local ranchers, but others likely came from the search parties sent by Salazar and his paramilitary allies. As the sun reached its zenith, Helena halted at a shallow ravine. The rock formations there were smooth, shaped by centuries of wind erosion. She crouched under an overhang to escape the sun's harsh glare, scanning the area with a small pair of old binoculars she had salvaged from the ghost town's shed. The desert stretched in every direction, shimmering with heat. She saw no sign of immediate danger. Deciding that the open daylight offered little chance of safe travel, she resolved to rest for a few hours and continue her journey under the cover of evening. She forced herself to take small sips of water from a dented canteen she had found, rationing the little supply she had. Her mind wandered to the past, to the specialized missions she had once led on foreign soil. It felt surreal to be out here alone, operating without backup or the safety net of a formal command. She remembered the sense of unity she had shared with her old team, how they each relied on one another's strengths. The men hunting her now, some of whom showed signs of formal training, could have been an echo of that world. She found it ironic that she had fled that life only to face an even more ambiguous threat in her own backyard. Helena remained motionless, dozing lightly in the shade until the desert began to cool. With twilight approaching, she gathered her pack, adjusting the straps to distribute the weight of the briefcase and documents. The partial gloom across the landscape gave her a momentary sense of relief. Distance provided a measure of safety, but she knew it wouldn't last. The conspirators behind the Silver Crescent had far-reaching resources. If they suspected she had stolen invaluable data, they would cast a wide net. Upon resuming her journey, she oriented herself using the faint glow of the setting sun, heading northwest toward an area where she remembered a cluster of ranches not far from a seldom-used county road. If she reached civilization without detection, she might find a vehicle or at least some chance of contacting Oswald Lane. She moved at a steady pace, ignoring the aches in her muscles. Each mile gained was another step away from the warehouse and another step closer to unmasking the operation. Night descended in full, revealing a canopy of stars. Helena remained cautious, stopping whenever she heard the hum of engines. At one point, distant headlights appeared on the horizon. She pressed herself flat against the ground, waiting until the faint glow vanished. She suspected it was either a local ranch truck or a search party weaving along dusty tracks. Only when she was certain they had gone did she rise and continue, the desert wind rustling dry brush around her feet. Near midnight, she found an abandoned trailer on the edge of a crumbling homestead. The structure's walls were riddled with holes, but a battered sofa inside offered a place to rest. She decided to risk a few hours of sleep. She barricaded the door with a loose plank and then wedged herself into a corner where she could not be seen from any window. She kept her pack and the briefcase close, dozing off with one ear attuned to the night sounds. A tense dream haunted her sleep, filled with echoes of her captivity in the warehouse, the flicker of failing lights, and the echo of boot steps on concrete. She jolted awake at the slightest sound outside, hand hovering near an improvised weapon, a piece of metal pipe she had found in the ghost town. The only movement, however, was a gust of wind rattling a loose panel on the trailer's exterior. Still, her heart hammered against her rib cage, and it took some time to calm herself. With adrenaline coursing through her veins again, she knew that meaningful rest would be impossible. She slipped outside, repacking her items under starlight, then set out once more, guided by the faint outline of distant foothills. By dawn, she reached a slope overlooking a cluster of ranches nestled around a dry creek bed. Small windmills spun languidly in the breeze, and a few outbuildings dotted the fields. Smoke curled from a chimney at the largest residence, suggesting life within. From her vantage point, Helena observed ranch hands going about their routines, feeding livestock, checking fences, and driving a well-worn tractor. She felt a pang at the memory of the Avinger Ranch, which once exuded the same everyday rhythms. The normalcy below stood in stark contrast to the conspiracy that festered in the region's shadows. She weighed the risks of approaching. The people there could be unwitting allies or potential informants for the Iron Depth network. Any contact could either lead to a lifeline or unravel her careful concealment. Yet, she needed more water and a chance to send word to someone she trusted. She decided on a cautious approach, circling the perimeter until she reached a cluster of trees that offered cover. She watched for several hours, cataloging movements and eavesdropping on fragments of conversation carried by the wind. The workers seemed genuinely preoccupied with daily tasks. She saw no sign of concealed weapons or suspicious visitors. With midday heat intensifying, she finally decided to take a chance. Moving from tree to tree, she approached a small shed where someone had set down a water canister. She watched as a ranch hand filled a bucket, then carried it away to an enclosure. She counted the seconds, waiting for him to disappear from view. In that window, she darted across open ground, silently reaching the canister. She refilled her own container, careful not to take too much, then retreated behind an old hay bale. Her heart pounded with the tension of possibly being spotted. When no alarm was raised, she exhaled a quiet breath of relief. Though she needed rest, a moment's improvised eavesdropping offered an unexpected break. From inside the main ranch house, a radio station's muffled commentary mentioned local news. The voice rattled off routine headlines about a county fair, a string of burglaries, and new proposals for land management. Helena caught a reference to suspicious activity on remote roads near the southern desert, which the announcer described as potential smuggling operations. It was a fleeting mention, overshadowed by more mundane news, but it confirmed that rumors were spreading. She also gleaned that the county sheriff was overwhelmed, requesting additional state assistance, but no formal task force had been deployed yet. Satisfied she had learned what she could without revealing herself, she slipped away, returning to the hillside. The sun scorched her shoulders, and she considered finding a covered spot to wait out the worst of it. She spotted a dry cave entrance built into a rocky outcropping. Inside, the shade offered relief from the searing heat. She settled into that sheltered space, unwrapped some of the documents, and reviewed them again, trying to commit more details to memory. Each new read reinforced her conviction that the Silver Crescent was far more than a local infiltration. She found references to shipments routed through Arizona, secret drop points in Nevada, and a coded mention of coastal facilities in California. Everywhere she looked, footprints of this conspiracy emerged, layered behind shell companies and corrupt officials. Late in the afternoon, she emerged from the cave and followed a winding route north, weaving between ranch properties and seldom patrolled roads. Eventually, she stumbled upon a narrow paved route leading toward a larger highway. She kept to the brush at the side, eyes peeled for passing vehicles. As night fell, she recognized that hitchhiking was risky, but continuing on foot would consume too much time. She needed to cover more ground, reach someone capable of taking the evidence to the right people. Under the moonlight, a pair of headlights appeared in the distance. She crouched low. As the vehicle neared, she saw it was a battered old pickup with a single driver. The truck slowed when it spotted her in the darkness. She tensed, unsure whether to run or risk revealing herself. The driver turned out to be a middle-aged rancher, from the looks of his dusty clothes and weather-beaten face. He glanced at her with curiosity rather than hostility. She deliberated for a moment, then decided to approach. She had hidden the briefcase and documents under her clothing as best she could, hoping not to appear threatening. Though she avoided direct speech, she communicated her need for a ride to the next town by gesturing and holding out a small wad of cash she had saved for emergencies. The driver seemed puzzled but not alarmed. He nodded, gesturing for her to climb in. She did so cautiously, staying near the door, ready to jump out if anything seemed amiss. The pickup rattled and bumped along, eventually merging onto the main highway. Helena kept her eyes on the side mirror, half expecting another vehicle to appear in pursuit. None came. After half an hour of driving, the lights of a modest town appeared, an outpost called Ironwood Fork, known for a truck stop and a few scattered motels. The driver pulled over near a gas station, where bright neon signs lit the empty parking lot. Helena nodded in gratitude and slid out. She watched the pickup drive away, disappearing into the night. The station itself remained open, staffed by a bored attendant flipping through a magazine behind the counter. Helena entered the small convenience store portion, scanning the shelves for supplies. She purchased a sports drink, a packet of dried food, and a ball cap to help obscure her features. Outside, she noted the presence of several parked semi-trucks, their engines idling. Nearby, a row of pay phones stood in a corner by a flickering street lamp. Most people considered pay phones relics, but they were exactly what Helena needed to avoid leaving a digital footprint. She approached one phone, pressing the receiver to her ear. A faint dial tone greeted her. She fished out some coins, then dialed a number she had memorized long ago, praying it remained active. The call connected to a voice mailbox that Oswald Lane had set up under an assumed identity. Helena typed in a numerical code, hoping Lane still monitored it. With the code accepted, she deposited a second series of inputs, each digit representing a cryptic sequence that signaled an urgent request for contact. She left no spoken message, trusting that Lane would interpret the code. Then she hung up, wiping down the phone and the keypad to remove any prints. By the time she exited the booth, her heart pounded. She scanned the area, paranoid that someone might have traced the call. Though it seemed unlikely at that hour, she couldn't discount the possibility that the Silver Crescent or the paramilitary teams monitored all forms of communication. Deciding she needed a low-profile place to rest, she surveyed the few motels around the truck stop. She selected a worn establishment with a vacancy sign flickering in the window, well away from the main intersection. The neon glow revealed chipped paint and a cracked pavement in the parking lot. It was the kind of place less likely to have security cameras or keep rigorous guest records. She used cash, signing under a false name. The desk clerk seemed too tired to care, sliding over a key with little more than a nod. The room itself was dingy, with outdated decor and the faint smell of stale smoke. Helena checked the window's lock, the bathroom's tiny vent, and then slid a chair against the door for extra security. Only then did she set down her pack and open the briefcase. She placed the documents on the bed, organizing them to form a clearer picture of the conspiracy's logistics. She noted the distinct possibility that some local officials might have been bribed or blackmailed, explaining why the Blood Talons operated so boldly. The notebook and microSD cards suggested that smuggling routes intersected with official shipping lanes at multiple points. A single corrupt official at each checkpoint could guarantee safe passage. Hours passed as she worked by the dim light of a bedside lamp, writing her own notes on a blank page she had found in the briefcase. She made a rough outline of who might be a key target for exposure, from local law enforcement to state-level functionaries. She recognized that there were bigger fish, possibly within federal ranks. But lacking direct proof, it remained speculation. Eventually, her eyes burned from strain, and she dozed off with her back against the headboard, the evidence spread out around her. She woke to the shrill ring of the bedside phone at midday. She startled upright, half expecting an intrusion. Her instincts screamed caution, but she forced herself to pick up the receiver. A static-laced silence filled the line for a few seconds, then a faint click. An automated voice repeated a numeric sequence, nothing that resembled a standard phone message. Helena realized it was an acknowledgement code from Oswald Lane, delivered through some third-party routing system. She instantly knew that Lane had received her message and was working out how to contact her more securely. Relieved, she replaced the receiver and gathered her thoughts. She had a window of opportunity, but she still had no idea where Lane was or how soon he could reach her. The tension within her grew again. The paramilitary group could be searching for her in a 20-county radius, maybe more. They might have begun shaking down local residents, or bribing motel owners to watch for suspicious guests. She decided to risk no more than one additional night in Ironwood Fork. If Lane failed to appear or connect with her by then, she would move on before the net closed in. Throughout that afternoon and evening, Helena kept to her room, curtains drawn. She ate a simple meal of dried food and water, resisting the urge to visit the motel diner. The fewer witnesses who saw her, the better. She busied herself rechecking the microSD cards, searching them for any hidden files or encryption clues she might have missed. As the sun went down, she caught glimpses of the parking lot from her window, noticing a few unfamiliar vehicles pulling in. Each time a car door slammed, her pulse raced, fearing it might be an armed unit come to drag her back into captivity. But no one knocked on her door. She tried to get some rest, though sleep came in fitful bursts. Near midnight, her phone rang again. She answered, tension gripping her. A muffled voice, clearly disguised with some audio tool, quietly recited a scrambled set of instructions. She caught references to a side road outside town and a broken billboard near mile marker 16. The directions implied a place to meet just before dawn. Then the line went dead. Helena exhaled a shaky breath, recognizing Lane's modus operandi: minimal words, cryptic references. If it was truly him, he would arrange a clandestine meeting far from prying eyes. But the possibility of a trap loomed in her mind. The paramilitary team might have forced Lane to reveal her contact codes, planning an ambush. Despite the risk, it was her only lead. She prepared methodically, packing all crucial documents and the digital media. She rummaged through a battered duffel bag left behind by a previous occupant. Inside she found an old flannel shirt and a pair of worn jeans that fit well enough to replace her dusty clothing. By the time she finished, the clock read a little past 2 in the morning. She slipped out of the motel room, returning the key to the front desk without a word, then stepped into the cool night air. Under a faint moon, she walked to the edge of the truck stop, scanning the area for suspicious vehicles. Finding none, she followed the shoulder of the main road on foot, the only sounds the hum of distant semi-trucks and the occasional chirp of insects. The broken billboard at mile marker 16 stood near a desolate patch of land overrun with tumbleweeds and a few scrawny mesquite trees. The night sky stretched overhead, vast and impenetrable. She approached quietly, mindful that if someone lay in wait, she had little cover. Yet the area appeared deserted, with no headlights or silhouettes betraying human presence. She perched behind the remnants of the billboard's wooden supports, scanning the desert for movement. Minutes crept by. A chill wind ruffled her new shirt, and she steadied her breathing, forcing herself to remain patient. Eventually, a dark SUV rolled in from the east, headlights off, engine barely audible. It stopped a short distance away. Her pulse quickened as the driver's door opened. A figure stepped out, shining a small, shielded flashlight in her general direction. She recognized the stance as Oswald Lane's, tall, slightly stooped at the shoulders, methodical in every gesture. He turned his face just enough for the moonlight to confirm his identity. Helena exhaled in relief, though she remained on guard. Lane stood there, scanning the surroundings, then flicked the flashlight once, a brief signal. Helena emerged, still gripping her pack in case she needed to run. He beckoned her to approach the SUV, clearly operating under the same caution that guided her. Reaching the vehicle, Helena noticed reinforced panels and a sophisticated radio setup inside. She felt a wave of gratitude that Lane had taken the risk to come this far. She did not speak, but the tension between them told a story of urgent danger. Lane pointed to the passenger seat. She got in, pressing herself against the door, eyes roving for any sign of pursuit. Lane turned the key, and the SUV lurched forward, headlights still off. In near darkness, they navigated a back road, heading toward an unknown destination. Lane drove for several miles, occasionally checking a handheld device that probably scanned for trackers or suspicious transmissions. Helena remained silent, her mind reeling with questions about what Lane had discovered. At last, they came to a remote service road. Lane stopped and cut the engine, then turned to face her. In subdued body language, he indicated that he'd been monitoring her short-coded messages, confirming that they had reason to suspect infiltration at multiple government levels. He gestured toward a locked steel case in the back seat, implying that he had compiled his own intelligence. Helena sensed they were both acutely aware that direct conversation might be dangerous, even in person. Electronic eavesdropping technology had become advanced enough that spoken words could be captured from surprising distances if the conspirators had planted bugs. Instead, Helena handed him the micro-SD cards and a portion of the physical documentation. Lane spent long minutes scanning the text with a small penlight. She watched his expression grow grim, though he maintained a veneer of professional composure. Even without speaking, they reached a mutual understanding. The data in those files would confirm ties between the Blood Talons, the Silver Crescent, and unknown players in positions of power. Without warning, the SUV's detection device beeped softly. Lane stiffened, flipping a switch on the console. Static hissed through the speakers, indicating a scrambled radio transmission in the vicinity. Helena's breath caught. She knew their meeting might have been tracked. Lane started the engine again, shutting off the detection device to avoid giving away their location. He accelerated, taking the rough gravel road at a pace that made the vehicle jostle violently. The tension was palpable, each bump threatening to toss them off the track. In the rearview mirror, Helena thought she saw faint lights, but they vanished into the darkness. They raced deeper into the desert, guided by the faint silhouette of distant rock formations. At some point, Lane flicked on the headlights to navigate a particularly treacherous turn. Moments later, a flash of light appeared behind them, revealing itself as another vehicle cresting a rise. Helena braced as Lane veered onto a side path, attempting to lose the tail in the labyrinth of canyons. The chase that followed was a stark reminder of how extensive the network's resources must be. Somewhere, watchers had zeroed in on this remote meeting. Dust rose in thick plumes behind them, and Helena heard the whine of an engine struggling to match Lane's abrupt maneuvers. Narrow canyon walls loomed, the SUV's headlights casting jagged shadows as they swerved to avoid rocks and debris. Lane maintained remarkable control, though the tension in his posture betrayed how close the pursuit was. Eventually, through a combination of skill and the winding canyon passages, the trailing lights faded. Helena scanned the darkness behind them, seeing no further sign of headlights. Lane killed the lights again and proceeded slowly, letting the hush of the desert night envelop them. They needed to avoid any direct routes back to civilization until they were sure they had lost their hunters. They emerged from the canyon onto a broader plain, bathed in moonlight. Lane guided the SUV off the trail and behind a cluster of boulders, where they parked. The engine clicked as it cooled. Together, they took stock of the situation in silence. Helena withdrew the briefcase from her pack, showing Lane the classified documents and pointing out the references to the southwestern corridor. Lane, in turn, pointed to a coded list in his steel case, indicating that multiple shipments had already been flagged by certain government watch lists before the Blood Talons or the suits manipulated official channels to erase the records. It was clear that time was running short. The Silver Crescent's infiltration plan was nearly complete in this region, and any evidence linking them to major crimes could trigger a wave of panic among their higher-ups. Both Helena and Lane knew that if they coordinated their findings, they might be able to persuade certain uncorrupted agents within the federal government to launch a targeted crackdown. But infiltration at high levels remained an obstacle. They would need to pick the right allies carefully or risk losing everything. Thus began their trek across the desert under a veil of secrecy, seeking a secure location where they could piece together their intel, upload it to multiple safe channels, and ensure it reached a wide enough audience that the Silver Crescent could not silence it. Each mile they traveled under the endless stars felt fraught with peril. But they carried on, bound by an unspoken pact to expose the corruption poisoning their homeland. For Helena, every turn of the wheels brought her closer to seeing justice served, and to returning to the ranch she had once believed was far beyond the reach of such darkness. Lane and Helena resumed their drive through the barren landscape, pressing deeper into the desert in near silence. The SUV's suspension groaned over rugged terrain, and swirling dust caught the moonlight, creating ghostly plumes behind them. With every mile they covered, Helena felt the weight of her stolen evidence pulling her closer to an inevitable confrontation. She recalled how quickly the conspirators had pinpointed her meeting with Lane. If they had advanced surveillance methods, they might already be mobilizing new teams or manipulating local law enforcement to block all escape routes. Yet she also sensed that her once solitary mission now had a greater chance of success, buoyed by Lane's capabilities and the fragments of intelligence he had pieced together on his own. When morning light finally crept over the desert horizon, Lane guided the SUV onto an unmarked service road. Faded tire tracks suggested it had once serviced a remote pipeline or radio station. They drove until they reached a rocky escarpment that overlooked a wide plateau. There, hidden against the natural folds of the land, was a small structure, a prefabricated cabin, weathered by years of sandstorms. Lane parked behind a grouping of large boulders, ensuring the vehicle was concealed from any aerial surveillance. Together, they approached the cabin on foot. Inside, the smell of stale air greeted them. Particles of dust danced in golden slivers of sunlight that entered through narrow, grimy windows. Old supplies and boxes cluttered the corners, and a battered table stood near the center. Lane's discreet movements suggested that he had used this hideaway in the past, likely as a fallback location during earlier investigations. Helena noted an old generator in the back room, along with portable encryption equipment that Lane quickly powered up. With a few adjustments, the room filled with a soft mechanical hum. They stood in silence, exchanging glances that confirmed their mutual resolve. Lane laid out his steel case on the table, opening it to reveal a rugged laptop fitted with specialized shielding and a portable satellite uplink. Helena set the briefcase and her backpack beside it, removing the microSD cards, the partial manifests, and the coded notebook that had triggered so much chaos. Lane retrieved an external device from his kit, something he could use to read and decrypt certain layers of data, if given enough time. He attached it to the laptop, began running diagnostics, then tapped out a sequence of commands with efficient composure. Helena hovered near, her tension palpable, as she waited to see if the digital fragments she had risked her life for would, in fact, produce the conclusive proof they needed. For the first hour, Lane's expression remained stoic, his eyes darting between lines of encrypted code. He connected an external drive labeled with obscure designations, cross-referencing the data from Helena's stolen files. Finally, he paused, tapping the screen to highlight a cluster of shipping routes, financial transactions, and internal memos that tied the Blood Talons, the Silver Crescent, and the paramilitary contractors to a single global network. Helena leaned forward, scanning the details. She recognized references to shipments that had passed through southwestern Colorado, as well as multi-state expansions. Other lines referenced overseas accounts in smaller countries known for their lax banking regulations. The conspiracy was deeper and more intricate than she had initially imagined. The two of them spent the remainder of the day piecing everything together, layering Lane's intelligence over Helena's newly acquired evidence. In total, they identified more than a dozen corridors across the southwestern states, each controlled by a different local group under the Iron Depth Network's broader umbrella. The Silver Crescent, it appeared, was some kind of command council bridging the top-level financiers, well-placed government insiders, and specialized paramilitary enforcers. The documentation even hinted at infiltration within certain federal agencies, though the names were masked behind cryptic aliases. Despite the complexity, Helena felt a surge of vindication. The truths she had suspected were laid out in grim detail before her. While they analyzed the files, Lane devised a plan to push the data to multiple safe havens simultaneously. He wanted to ensure that no single interception could bury the truth. The portable satellite link allowed for short bursts of data transmission, which could be targeted to personal servers controlled by a handful of trusted contacts. Helena understood the risk of revealing their location whenever they powered the uplink, but they had little choice if they wanted to get the evidence into the right hands quickly. Once the transmissions began, they would effectively declare war on the Silver Crescent, leaving themselves exposed to retaliation. Evening set in, and the desert air cooled. Lane and Helena took turns stepping outside to watch for dust trails or the glare of distant headlights. Each time, the horizon remained empty, though they both knew the absence of visible threats meant little. The conspirators could use drones, satellite imagery, or simply wait to intercept them on roads leading out of the desert. Nonetheless, Helena drew strength from the knowledge that once the data was out, the Silver Crescent would find it harder to operate in secrecy. Shortly after midnight, Lane initiated the first series of uploads, carefully monitoring the signal strength and ensuring minimal transmission windows. Helena prepared for the worst, pacing near the entrance, a small sidearm in hand, an old piece Lane had stashed in the cabin. Lane worked methodically, eyes glued to the laptop. Data logs scrolled in real time, lines of text confirming partial success as each file package reached one of several designated destinations. He moved on to the next set of transmissions, uploading to backup servers in different parts of the country, then to an overseas contact who specialized in leaking corruption cases to global watchdog organizations. About halfway through the transmissions, Lane stiffened. A red warning flashed on the laptop. He typed a new command, but the screen went blank for a moment, replaced by an ominous prompt indicating that a powerful external force was jamming the signal. Helena tensed, immediately peering through a crack in the cabin's door. The desert night was still, but she felt a growing sense of unease. Lane attempted to reroute the transmission through another satellite channel, only to encounter the same jamming pattern. Helena realized with a cold certainty that the conspirators had leveraged advanced tech to block the data. Part of the files had gone through, but the rest remained trapped on the device. Lane ran a quick diagnostic, concluding that a nearby jamming system had locked onto their signal. He reached under the table for a battered assault rifle, clearly prepared for the possibility of a siege. Helena clicked off the cabin's lone lamp, plunging them into darkness except for the glow of the laptop screen. A tense silence followed. They strained their ears for the sound of approaching vehicles or drones. Outside, the desert wind whispered over the rocky terrain. Minutes passed, and neither of them dared to move. Finally, Lane used the laptop's battery to power a directional antenna. He reasoned that if they could pinpoint the source of the jamming, they might circumvent it or at least know which route to avoid. Data began to trickle onto the screen, faint signals, fluctuating erratically. Helena recognized that the conspirators weren't employing standard radio jammers. These were likely custom devices used by the paramilitary teams. If they had pinned down the cabin's general location, it would only be a matter of time before they converged in force. Lane shut the laptop, hurriedly packing the gear. Helena gathered up the documents, micro SD cards, and the last items from the briefcase. They could not remain in that cabin any longer. Moving under the cover of darkness was their only hope. Lane quietly opened a trapdoor in the floor, revealing an improvised tunnel that led outside. The existence of this escape route confirmed that he had once planned for an urgent departure from this location. He handed Helena a small flashlight with a red filter, and they descended into the narrow passage. Emerging in a dry ravine about 50 yards from the cabin, they crouched among the rocks. A faint smell of rust and old earth clung to the place, but it shielded them from any immediate line of sight. Above, the stars shone impassively. Lane gestured that they should circle wide around to where the SUV was hidden, verifying first that no enemy forces lay in ambush. They crawled along the ravine's edge, rifles and gear in hand, hearts pounding. At last, they peered around a boulder to see if the cabin was under surveillance. The place looked deserted. No lights, no vehicles, no foot soldiers. Yet the presence of a jamming device implied that watchers could be stationed further away, scanning for movement. Lane and Helena doubled back, skirting the rocky outcropping until they reached the SUV. They found it untouched, possibly still unseen by their pursuers. Lane nodded at Helena, then climbed inside to start the engine. He kept the headlights off, relying on night vision goggles he retrieved from the back seat. Helena positioned herself in the passenger seat, weapon in her lap, scanning the darkness as they rolled slowly away. The uneasy silence persisted for miles. Under the hush of the desert night, they navigated a winding track, careful not to stir up too much dust. Eventually, faint ridgelines gave way to flatter plains, where the vegetation thinned. The jamming never fully ceased, occasionally causing Lane's detection device to beep softly in warning. Helena suspected that the paramilitary squads were operating from a vantage point or using a mobile platform. She and Lane had only partially delivered the data. Finishing the job was now even more critical. They arrived at a dried lake bed, bordered by craggy hills. Lane parked behind a cluster of rocks near the perimeter. This would be another temporary halt, an effort to re-evaluate their options. Though they had eluded immediate capture, they could not complete the second half of the uploads under these conditions. Lane consulted a map on his laptop, searching for a location with enough topographical cover to help them evade jamming signals. At least long enough to transmit the remaining files. While Lane studied the map, Helena stood guard outside. The night was still, but she felt a prickling in her skin, as if an unseen presence roamed the darkness. Memories of the warehouse, the paramilitary guards, and Salazar's arrogance flooded her mind. She exhaled slowly, refocusing on the mission. The evidence must reach safe channels if they were to unravel the Silver Crescent's power structure. Anything less, and the conspiracy would regroup, covering its tracks. Lane emerged from the SUV, pointing to a remote canyon deeper in the wilderness, a place known as Red Gap. According to old geological surveys, the canyon walls there were lined with minerals capable of interfering with certain electronic signals. If they could get inside that canyon, the paramilitary jamming equipment might prove less effective, allowing them to broadcast the remainder of their data. Helena acknowledged the plan, surveying the path across the lake bed. She guessed it would take most of the night to reach Red Gap on foot, even longer by vehicle if they had to skirt rocky areas. They agreed on a dual approach. Lane would drive the SUV at a slow pace around the edges of the lake bed to draw attention, if any watchers were scouring the horizon. Helena would proceed on foot, cutting straight across the basin, thus splitting their potential detection profile. They would rendezvous near the canyon entrance. If either one encountered trouble, the other might stand a chance of completing the mission. Without exchanging words, they fell into motion. Lane steered the SUV away, hugging the outer rim of the lake bed, while Helena slung her pack over her shoulder and slipped into the open expanse. The ground crunched under Helena's boots, the crusted soil betraying the presence of ancient water long since evaporated. She moved swiftly, pausing occasionally to scan the horizon for silhouettes or headlights. The starlight provided minimal illumination, but her eyes adapted as best they could. When she was halfway across, she thought she saw a brief flash of light in the distance, possibly a reflection off glass or metal. She froze, crouching low. The flash didn't repeat. She continued on, maintaining a steady, determined pace until the basin's far edge rose into the first ridges leading toward Red Gap. By the time she reached a cluster of boulders near the canyon's entrance, the moon was dropping low on the horizon. Shadows elongated, cloaking the ravines in deep darkness. She found a concealed spot and waited, heart pounding. The minutes stretched into an hour, then another. Finally, the faint sound of the SUV's engine reached her ears. Lane arrived, headlights still off. He had circled around unseen. He parked the vehicle out of sight behind a rocky protrusion, then joined Helena. Together, they crept into Red Gap, working their way through narrow passages chiseled by centuries of wind and sparse rainfall. The canyon walls were tall and jagged, and if Lane's research proved correct, the mineral composition might hamper the paramilitary jammers. Helena felt the cool stone against her fingertips. Each echo of their footsteps seemed too loud, but they pressed on until the canyon opened into a hidden bowl-like depression. The place had steep walls and very little overhead visibility, making it an unlikely spot for a direct helicopter landing or an easy infiltration by ground vehicles. Lane tested the satellite link on his laptop, setting it on a flat rock. He turned on the device, and to their relief, the detection monitor showed no sign of jamming signals. The canyon's composition appeared to be blocking or scattering external interference. Lane lost no time initiating the transmissions, sending the remaining chunks of data to multiple destinations. Helena stood guard, scanning the canyon's rim with a pair of infrared binoculars, hoping that the paramilitary squads had no direct line of sight into this natural fortress. The upload proceeded more smoothly than before, each file chunk confirming a successful transfer to secure nodes around the country and abroad. Helena held her breath each time the laptop beeped, half expecting a wave of static or disconnection. Finally, Lane typed a final command, packaging the entire data trove, complete shipping manifests, references to compromised officials, and the financial leads that tied everything to the Silver Crescent. Once done, he set the device to broadcast a coded alert to one last receiver. That alert, Helena knew, was the call sign for certain trusted individuals within the federal apparatus who owed Lane favors from past operations. They exhaled simultaneously. No jamming materialized, no gunshots echoed from the ridges above. Lane disconnected the link, shut down the laptop, and then physically removed the storage drive. Nothing remained but a tense silence, broken only by the shuffle of pebbles underfoot. Outside the natural basin, the first hints of dawn began to light the eastern sky, painting the canyon walls in muted shades of red and orange. Helena realized that while they might have succeeded in exposing the conspiracy, they were far from safe. The conspirators, enraged by the breach, would stop at nothing to exact vengeance. Yet a flicker of hope coursed through her. The data was out, unstoppable. The Silver Crescent could not erase it now. They made their way back to the SUV, silently determined to move on before pursuers guessed their location. Driving cautiously through the canyon's narrow passages, they emerged onto a higher plateau. Here, the sun rose in full splendor, revealing a vast swath of desert that stretched all the way to distant mountain ranges. Lane steered them onto a seldom-used trail, heading in the general direction of the Avinger Ranch. Helena had left it behind under duress, but it remained her home, and the conspirators might be massing for a final play to seize the property or retaliate. As they descended from the plateau, they could see signs of the local roads in the distance. Dust rose from multiple vehicles traveling at speed, though it was unclear whether they were friend or foe. Lane pulled off into a stand of mesquite trees, shutting off the engine while they observed. After a few minutes, Helena spotted the distinctive shape of paramilitary trucks, marked only by camouflage paint, forging a direct route toward the southwestern corridor. The Blood Talons, she suspected, might still be operating in parallel, or perhaps had already been sidelined by the more disciplined teams. Lane eased the SUV onto a back route. They took a winding path to avoid direct confrontation, stopping periodically to verify the roads were clear. By late afternoon, they neared the outskirts of the region where Helena's ranch lay. The terrain flattened, dotted with scattered clusters of trees and a few small hills. Helena recalled that Levi, her husband, was adept at reading trouble well before it arrived. Still, she worried that he faced immediate peril from Salazar or any newly emboldened conspirators. Suddenly, an explosion reverberated in the distance, sending a plume of dust and debris skyward. Lane and Helena exchanged alarmed glances as the shockwave rattled the SUV's windows. They accelerated, following the echo of destruction until they reached a vantage point atop a low ridge. From there, Helena's heart lurched as she recognized the road leading to the Avinger property. Flames licked the sky near a barn on the far side of the ranch, while figures scrambled in the yard, silhouetted against the chaos. Lane steered the SUV down the slope, careful to keep them partially concealed by the terrain. When they reached the boundary fence, Helena jumped out, pressing herself low to the ground. She peered through binoculars at the unfolding mayhem. A group of heavily armed men, distinct from the local bikers, had converged near the ranch buildings. Several small vehicles ringed the area. She could see Levi, forced to his knees by a man brandishing an assault rifle. Smoke poured from a storage structure that had evidently been rigged with explosives or caught in crossfire. At the heart of it all was a tall figure wearing tactical gear, shouting instructions that carried faintly on the wind. Helena recognized the posture and stance. This was no disorganized gang. The paramilitary presence made it clear that the conspirators had pivoted to direct action. Perhaps suspecting that Helena would return. They were likely prepared to destroy the ranch entirely if it meant erasing evidence or punishing her. Her hands trembled as she surveyed the scene. She had always feared that her past might draw dangerous elements into Levi's life, and now that fear was realized with brutal clarity. Lane joined her, scanning the area. He motioned that they had the element of surprise, at least for a moment. He pointed to an outbuilding near the far edge of the property, half-collapsed but offering a possible route for covert approach. Helena nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. Adrenaline drowned out any second thoughts. They moved quickly, hugging the contours of the land, inching closer to the ranch perimeter while staying behind partial cover. Fire crackled and popped from the damaged barn, sending up black smoke. The acrid smell stung Helena's nostrils. They reached the outbuilding, a remnants of an older storage shed that had partially caved in. Through the broken boards, Helena spied the paramilitary squads fanning out. A handful of men guarded Levi, while others swept the ranch house. The tall leader seemed to be orchestrating a search operation, perhaps for the hidden documents or for Helena herself. She saw Salazar too, standing off to one side, barking at some of his old biker associates who looked terrified and out of their depth. Clearly, the Blood Talons had been relegated to grunt work. The new arrivals were in charge now. Lane handed Helena a spare rifle, pointing to a vantage in the ruins' rafters. She climbed silently, finding a narrow slot through which she could aim if necessary. Lane, meanwhile, crept around the side, presumably to take up a flanking position. Helena slowed her breathing, taking mental aim on the guard who stood watch over Levi. Though she wanted nothing more than to eliminate that threat instantly, she had to time her move to avoid an immediate onslaught from the rest of the squad. Each second felt like an eternity as she watched Levi kneel in the dirt, arms behind his back, face contorted in anger and defiance. In a sudden burst of motion, a distant roar signaled Lane's diversionary tactic. He had hurled a smoke grenade into the center of the yard. Thick clouds billowed across the scene, obscuring line of sight. Shouts erupted, and the paramilitary troopers scrambled to reposition. Helena took the opening, firing 2 precise shots that dropped the guard nearest Levi. Levi threw himself aside, rolling behind a water trough. Another series of shots rang out from the opposite side of the property, Lane providing covering fire. Chaos ensued, men shouting to regroup, Salazar cursing as he realized they were under attack from multiple angles. In the swirl of smoke, Helena leapt from the rafters and dashed across the open yard, zigzagging between burning debris. Gunfire tore into the ground around her. She slid behind an old tractor, reloading in a swift motion. The tall leader barked orders, urging his squad to coordinate, but Helena and Lane pressed their advantage, striking from unexpected positions. Levi, seizing an opportunity, disarmed an injured mercenary and crawled toward the nearest cover. Helena felt a flash of relief at the sight of him alive and resisting. The paramilitary force regrouped by the ranch house, using the exterior walls as partial cover. Their training kicked in, they laid down suppressive fire, forcing Helena back behind the tractor. Bullets ricocheted off metal. Smoke from the burning barn thickened the air, making it difficult to see. Helena heard Lane's rifle from the far side, returning volley for volley. She tried to gauge how many adversaries remained. Perhaps a dozen, minus those already down. Too many for a simple frontal assault. As she was about to move, Salazar emerged from behind a corral fence, brandishing a handgun. His face contorted with rage, he fired wildly in Helena's direction. She ducked behind the tractor's massive tire, hearing bullets ping off machinery. One round struck the side of the tractor engine, sending sparks. Helena forced herself to remain calm, waiting for Salazar to come closer. He advanced in a fury. Screaming about the land, the betrayal, the impossible obstacles she had thrown at him. Yet, even in his rage, he was no match for her experience. She flanked him, catching him off guard with a quick maneuver behind the corral's broken planks. With a single calculated strike, she knocked the gun from his hand and brought him to the ground. Salazar's eyes widened in disbelief, rage giving way to desperation. Helena didn't linger. She left him prone, disarmed, and scrambled back toward Levi, who was pinned down behind the water trough by the paramilitary troopers' coordinated barrage. The tall leader, recognizing Salazar's failure, rallied his men for a final push. Helena clenched her jaw, bracing for a potentially lethal standoff. She saw Lane emerge from behind a half-toppled fence, eyes locked on the cluster of armed men near the ranch house. He tossed a small device that clattered on the ground at their feet, a stun or flash munition. It detonated with a blinding flash, buying enough time for Helena to sprint to Levi. She reached him, pulling him to his feet. He gripped a scavenged rifle but appeared unsteady, clearly exhausted. Together, they retreated behind a stone well that offered sturdier cover. Lane joined them, crouching low, reloading. By now, the paramilitary group had partially recovered from the flash munition. They opened fire again, bullet impacts pulverizing chunks of stone. Helena scanned the property, spotting a diesel tank near the barn's remains. If she could create a diversion there, perhaps the sudden explosion would break the enemy line. Exchanging a quick, tense nod with Lane, Helena crawled along a shallow depression in the ground, bullets whizzing overhead. She reached the tank, searching for a way to trigger an explosion without being caught in the blast. The flames from the smoldering barn were not far off. She found a broken shovel handle, wrapped a piece of cloth around it, and dipped it into a patch of burning embers. Then, counting down silently, she jammed the burning end against a small vent in the diesel tank's side, rolling away in the opposite direction as quickly as possible. A massive blast shook the property, sending up a fireball that lit the twilight sky. The shockwave staggered everyone still standing, friend and foe alike. The paramilitary troopers near the ranch house were thrown to the ground by the force. Helena shielded her face from flying debris. Smoke and dust enveloped the yard, reducing visibility to near zero. In that brief window of chaos, Helena, Lane, and Levi made a break for the vehicles. They scrambled to the SUV, Lane at the wheel. Helena forced open a back door for Levi, hauling him inside. The tires spun on scorched earth as Lane accelerated, smashing through a damaged section of fencing and tearing across open pasture. Gunfire echoed behind them, but the muzzle flashes were wild in the swirling smoke. Within moments, they had outdistanced the disoriented paramilitary squads. Helena looked back, seeing flames leap higher as the diesel tank continued to burn. She felt no triumph in the destruction. It was a tragic irony that her home had become a battlefield. But the main priority was survival, ensuring that the truth they had broadcast could bring justice to everyone harmed by this conspiracy. They drove for miles, the engine sputtering occasionally from the rough terrain. Levi remained quiet, in shock, though he gave Helena a look of fierce gratitude. Lane navigated a labyrinth of dirt tracks and back roads, relying on old knowledge of the region. Dawn broke over them once more, illuminating a new day that carried the possibility of vindication. The paramilitary squads might regroup, but so would federal and state agencies who, by now, had received the damning evidence. The Silver Crescent had finally been exposed. In the days that followed, Helena learned that the partial data transmissions had reached multiple investigative arms of the federal government, as well as several international watchdog groups. Headlines emerged, revealing a massive conspiracy implicating corporate interests, rogue intelligence contractors, and complicit officials. Arrests took place in several states. And the blood talons disintegrated under the combined pressure of law enforcement and public scrutiny. The paramilitary team scattered, though some pockets resisted, leading to smaller-scale confrontations in remote areas. Lane and Helena, aided by a few sympathetic allies, arranged for Levi's protection while the ranch underwent repairs. Though the land bore scars of explosion and firefight, the Avinger home survived as a testament to resilience. Helena spent long hours helping Levi rebuild. She found the nights strangely quiet after all the chaos, yet the sense of danger never fully dissipated. The Silver Crescent's higher echelons might have been exposed, but power structures that large rarely vanished without leaving remnants behind. Over time, a new equilibrium emerged. News outlets continued to uncover hidden layers of corruption from the data that Helena and Lane had unleashed. Politicians and agency heads scrambled to distance themselves from the scandal. Investigations branched out internationally, revealing an even broader network of shadowy deals. While many conspirators faced charges, a few disappeared without a trace, presumably fleeing the country or retreating into the underworld. Helena reclaimed her life on the ranch, though a subdued vigilance now colored her daily routines. She tended livestock, repaired fences, and walked the charred edges of the property where the barn once stood. Her past had come roaring back, but she had survived the onslaught and ensured that the vile network threatening her home was brought into the light. Levi adapted as well, his calm acceptance of Helena's hidden background tempered by admiration for her courage. Together, they worked to restore a sense of normalcy, uncertain whether that word still applied after all that had happened. Lane vanished back into the shadows, leaving behind a simple note acknowledging victory but reminding Helena that vigilance remained essential. She suspected he was off to chase the next threat, the next infiltration that might undermine legitimate authority. He had always been a wanderer, connected to events larger than himself. Helena felt gratitude for his help, knowing their paths might cross again if new shadows emerged. Over time, the ghost of the Silver Crescent lingered, a reminder that corruption rarely dies easily. Still, Helena's evidence, shared broadly and backed by Lane's efforts, had shattered the network's stranglehold in the region. New officials stepped in, attempting to restore faith in institutions that had once failed to stop the infiltration. Ranchers banded together to protect their lands, forging coalitions to resist intimidation and illegal land grabs. Communities grew stronger under the shared resolve not to let hidden powers rule their fate. On the outskirts of the Avinger ranch, a lone coyote howled at dusk, its voice echoing over the wide fields. Helena stood at the porch, scanning the horizon with a quiet poise. She wore the same dusty boots as always, but the weight of her experiences had carved new lines of resolve into her features. She understood that her life would never be as simple as it once seemed, that peace came with a price, and that vigilance was the only safeguard against those who lurked in the shadows. Yet, as the ranch lights clicked on and she saw Levi wave from the barn, Helena felt a deep sense of assurance. The truth had come to light, and for now, her home stood free of the conspirators' grasp. Night settled over the land, hush and still. The memory of clandestine deals, paramilitary strikes, and coded transmissions drifted into history, replaced by the enduring spirit of those who refused to surrender to corruption. Helena had faced down the storm, and though the scars would remain, a new dawn always followed the darkness. In that knowledge, she found both solace and the will to stand guard against whatever next chapter might unfold in the endless struggle between hidden power and those who dared to challenge it.